Guys, welcome to the Mars 2020 series. In part 3, I'm going to be taking you through a timeline of previous events when Mars would have gone into retrograde in Aries. Astrology is a study of the cosmos. We look at patterns of recurring events, and we try to link that to events that happen on Earth to see if there is a pattern. And essentially, what I've done with this presentation is to look across the 20th century, and there are 4 events where Mars has gone into retrograde, and I'm going to look at each in turn. So starting with 1909. Starting with the chart of 1909, now I'm going to give you a brief overview of the basics of astrology. We know that Mars is referred to as the minor malefic, and Saturn is known as the great malefic. So you can see there's a theme of the extent by which the malefics have an impact. What modern astrologers haven't done is to label the planets beyond Saturn. In my own mind, I always think of, in order, I always think of Uranus as the greater malefic, and I refer to Pluto as a supreme malefic. So when we have Mars going into retrograde in its own sign, we know it's going to be a pretty bad year. We also know that the outer planets set the general underlying theme for those periods. So with Uranus being in Capricorn, the sign of leaderships, kings, generals, we know that there's going to be attacks on leaders and kings. Similarly, we know that Pluto was transiting Gemini, and Gemini is a sign for Armenia. Now, there's a recurring theme with Armenia. Every time Mars does go retrograde in Aries, Armenia does tend to be affected in some shape or form. So I will explain what happened to the Armenians in 1909. Starting with changes in leadership. In 1909, you got the leaders on the left-hand side, which were all superseded and or overthrown by leaders on the right-hand side. So starting at the top with the Ottoman Empire, we've got Abdulhamid II, who was, it's interesting, all the leaders on the left-hand side are known for their brutality and their tyrants of their time. Now, Abdulhamid II was known as one of the last sultans of the Ottoman Empire. He was actually responsible for the massacre that took place against the Armenians, which we will go on to look at. He was superseded by his brother Mehmet V. And then we had in Belgium King Leopold II. He was especially brutal and known for his brutality on the people of Congo, who at that time were under control of Belgium and were producing rubber for them. And every time that rubber quotas went down, he would punish the workers by amputating their arms. Now again, amputations are, if you remember from our previous videos, are related to Mars and the Martian energy. And he was he actually died in 1909. And again, interesting, if you've seen my video in part 1, I explained of the physiological changes that occurs in the body when Mars goes into retrograde in Aries. I explained that the yellow ball within the body increases, which in turn increases the blood flow, which can result in the risk of strokes and heart attacks. And King Leopold II died that year of a stroke, and he was superseded by King Albert I, who was referred to as the Night King or the Soldier King. Again, that's interesting because if you remember from the first video, we said that Mars is associated to soldiers, and that famous painting by Joffre with a soldier running through it. Firefighters and the police are also associated to this Martian energy, and we'll see this theme reoccurring throughout this presentation. And in Iran, we had a revolution. Now, again, we see the theme of a revolution because Aries is associated to freedom, um, wanting to have independence and freedom. So the revolution that happened in Iran, which forced Muhammad Ali Shah of the Qajar dynasty to abdicate, was because he was trying to take away the power from the Iranian parliament. And he had to abdicate, and his son had to come onto the throne at a very young age. The next section I'd like us to look at are assassinations and massacres. In 1909, the Adana massacre occurred, where the Ottoman Turks were responsible for the genocide of 15 to 30,000 Armenian Christians during that year. Now, we will see that ethnic cleansing and genocides are a general theme that seems to reoccur during Mars retrograde in Aries. In Nicaragua, 500 revolutionaries were executed that year, again stamping out their fight for freedom. And in Japan, we had the Japanese Prime Minister and the Resident General of Korea, who were both assassinated by a Korean revolutionary who was trying to fight for the freedom of Korea. So we can see these themes will reoccur during the following periods we'll look at. The final area I want us to look at are new inventions, new beginnings that occur during Mars retrograde in Aries, as both Mars and Aries are in astrology are related to new events, new starts. As the sun transits Aries every year, we know that's spring, the start of the new year, which is celebrated by the Persians as a new year. So we can see that in 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was incorporated in Iran, and we can see that in Tel Aviv, the first Jewish communities start to set up settlements in that country. That's important as we go on to look at future years and what the general theme of the Jewish community when Mars is in retrograde in Aries. We also have Louis Blériot, who was the first man to fly across the English Channel. And finally, the U.S. Army purchases its first first military airplane from the Wright brothers. Now, this is an interesting theme. Every time we see Mars retrograde in Aries, the U.S. military seems to come up with new weapons and new aircraft, and I'll speak about that as we go through the presentation. So that was 1909. What happened in 1941? Let's start by taking a quick look at the astrological chart, see what was happening during that year, and to see if that gives us any clues as to the important events that are supposed to be happening. So, starting with the most important event, which is the Saturn-Uranus conjunction that happens on the cusp of Taurus and then Gemini. And now, this is very important. So you've got the two malefics coming into conjunction, which is a very strong aspect. Now, Taurus relates to the Jewish people, and Gemini actually relates to the USA, as it's ascendant of the USA in the chart that I personally use. So by looking at that, we can see initially there is going to be a massacre of the Jewish people, followed by an attack on the USA. Now, I've just made this note here that this aspect repeats itself towards the back end of Gemini, and we'll see this happening in 2030 to 2032. So I believe we will see some form of war or attack happening in the US during that year. And whereas Pluto, the supreme malefic as I call it, it's in the sign of Leo. Now, Leo is a fire sign. It relates to pride and ego and aggression and wars. And I'll go on to explain what happens during 1941 and aggressive leaders and the fires that take control of the whole world during that period. Now, so whenever it comes to the main themes, I highlight the war and assassination and massacres that we've seen in the chart in red, just to try to give a stronger correlation as to which areas I think there's going to be a prominence with regards to this Mars retrograde. So in 1941, obviously starting with wars, we've got World War II going on. And obviously the whole world was engulfed with warfare, fires, explosions. But the key things I wanted to highlight was, if you remember from my video Mars part 2, I explained that when Mars is in retrograde movement, when it starts that backwards movement in our night skies, it's the worst time to for one country to attack another, and for one person even to personally attack any other individuals in the form of legal attacks or complaints. And we can see that Operation Typhoon started, where the German offensive against Moscow, the German army invaded Russia, who was previously their allies, and essentially that attack resulted in the downfall of Hitler during World War II. I just wanted to highlight that point, and just to go into some of the themes that we see. So the Soviet evacuation of Tallinn, that was the bloodiest naval battle during the war. And of course, Pearl Harbor. Again, that happened during a Mars retrograde. So Japan, at the time, the Japanese emperor and generals decided this was the best time for them to carry out an offensive against the U.S. Army. And we've seen the famous images of Pearl Harbor. And we know the outcome. Again, Japan was the aggressor in that instance. And as a result, we know that the Japanese lost that war. So a very important lesson, and we'll see this theme reoccurring. The advice to anyone or any nation is, well, first of all, don't attack each other. And second of all, if you are going to choose a time for a battle or an attack or a legal attack, do it when Mars is not in its retrograde movement. And 1941 was obviously a big year with regards to the Holocaust and essentially the massacre that took place throughout Europe against the Jewish community. And a reoccurring theme that we're seeing is that there's a change in leadership, once again in Iran, starting with the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran to secure the Iranian oil fields. The British essentially took control of the southern part of Iran and the Russians the northern. And we can see that Reza Shah, the king of the time, was forced to abdicate, and his son Mohammad Reza Shah took control of the country. 1941 was also an important year, as it was the commencement for the construction of the Pentagon, which is a U.S. department, home to the U.S. Department of Defense. And when you look at the decisions and the events that have taken place in the Pentagon since the 1940s, I'm sure you would recognize the correlations there to Mars. Interesting fact about the construction of the Pentagon, I didn't realize this. From the moment that the concrete was first poured to the first phase completing and people actually moving into the offices there, it was done within 8 months. And as a developer, I wish I could finish projects that quickly, especially projects of that size. So working at phenomenal speed, and again, we know Mars is associated with speed and getting things done quickly. So let's start by looking at 1973. In 1971, we essentially had both Uranus and Pluto in the sign for Libra. Now, Libra is a sign for the Middle East, the Far East, trade and cooperation, partnerships, and I would also say amusement parks are associated to that. It's a fun sign. So with both these malefics and heavyweights being in that sign, we would expect the underlying theme for that year to be associated and related to attacks and fires and catastrophes to those areas of the world. So starting with wars as a highlighted area for that year, sure enough, in the Middle East, the Yom Kippur War begins. Once again, we've got a war beginning with Mars in retrograde, with the Arab nations coming together, collaborating and attacking Israel. And the outcome was that Israel was able to defeat them. Every time we've seen an attack happening during a Mars retrograde, essentially the people who initiate the attack end up losing that war. The interesting fact was we start seeing a theme where long-lasting wars and battles that were going on tend to end during Mars retrogrades in Aries. So we got the U.S. bombing of Cambodia was halted that year, and the U.S. was involved in the Far East in various battles for around 12 years up to that point. We also have trade wars taking place. In 1973, there was an energy crisis because obviously you've got the Arab states kind of bullying their way against the United States and their support for Israel. We've also got Papua New Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, who both get their self-governance and independence during that year. In 1973, we also start to see a theme of crashes that are taking place. We have numerous airplane crashes, the worst ones being the Tupolev Tu-144 that crashed during the Paris Air Show, and the Varig Flight 820 that crashes in France, killing 123 people. Delta Airlines Flight 173 lands short of the runway, killing 83 passengers. And you can see the theme that's going on here. We've also got a number of Formula One drivers, Roger Williams and Francois and Sevet, that both died in crashes during that year. Formula One, cars generally being associated with Mars Formula One because of their speed, even more so. So there's an underlying theme that's starting to build up here from 1973. And once again, we do see changes in leadership during that year as well. And there were a number of military coups that take place that year, starting with Greece, where the royal family are essentially stopped their rulership. You've got Uruguay and Chile, General Pinochet taking control, and even in Afghanistan, the king of Afghanistan is essentially succeeded by his cousin Mohammed Dawood Khan. And we've got the Thai popular uprising, which took place in Thailand. Again, many people losing their lives there as well, where the populace come together and demand freedom. Essentially, that's what usually happens during a Mars retrograde in Aries. We've also got the king of Sweden who passes away and his grandson takes control. And with regards to assassinations and massacres, I've got a long list of various ones. I'm just going to highlight the key ones in this slide. Essentially, Bruce Lee died that year. Now, I know a lot of people think Bruce Lee died of natural causes, but there are conspiracy theories around the fact that Bruce Lee was assassinated and poisoned. And we've also got the Azira massacre that happened in Argentina, where a sniper opened fire and killed 13 people. We've got the Lillehammer affair, in which the Mossad agents accidentally mistake a Moroccan waiter for a Palestinian operative. And another big one I would like to highlight is the Spanish Prime Minister Luis Carrero Blanco is assassinated by ETA in Spain. With regards to fires that took place that year, once again, the list is very long, and so I will let you go through it all in details yourselves. But the key ones I wanted to cover was the catastrophic belief that occurred in Arizona. Now, the propane was being transferred from a rail car into a tanker, and that suddenly ignited and resulted in this explosion. And we've also got the Avianca building in Bogota in Colombia that catches fire during that Mars transit of Aries. And we've also got flash fires killing 51 people in the Summerland amusement park. Now, I've highlighted that one because if you remember, the Uranus and Pluto were both transiting Libra, and that related to amusement parks, and that was essentially the event that transpired as a result of that. Now, finally, the other thing I wanted to highlight was the typhoon that essentially went across the Philippines, killing 27 people and causing $5 million worth of damage. Now, the reason I want to highlight typhoons is we said as Aries goes into retrograde as Mars goes retrograde in Aries, that results in abnormally hot summers. And when you have an abnormally hot summer and you enter the autumn period, you suddenly have a sudden change in temperature, which results in high winds and typhoons and tornadoes. And again, this is the first recorded instance that we see within this astrological signature. So I wanted to highlight that as I would expect that theme to follow through into 2020 as well. So what other events happened during 1973? We know that Russians launched 2 spacecraft to study Mars. Now, it's not an accident that these are launched during a Mars retrograde. So the fact that a Mars retrograde in astrology highlights that specific year for the energies involved with Mars. Another highlight that takes place is the fact that for it to be retrograding, the cycle of Earth and Mars means that they're at the closest point to one another. So if anyone wants to launch a craft to Mars, that is probably the best time to do it. We also had the World Trade Center opening up in 1973, and we know the ultimate course and life of that building, those 2 buildings, I should say. And we'll see that during the next Mars retrograde of 1988, the person responsible for bringing down the World Trade Center actually came to power. We had the Watergate scandal and a personal attack on the president of the U.S., which actually resulted in him being impeached. And we had the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, being founded in the U.S., which was an organization, a policing organization designed to target the trafficking of drugs and to stop it. So That's 1973 covered. So let's look at 1988, and let's start by looking at the chart for 1988. Now, we can see once again there's an important event, a conjunction happening between the outer planets, and you can see almost 3 of the outer planets, which makes it a very important event. So we're going to see a long list of things happening, but where is the conjunction happening? It's between Saturn and Uranus, happening within Sagittarius. Now, Sagittarius is a sign for airplanes, travel, religion. So the sort of events we would expect to occur are plane accidents. Now, Uranus is a planet of invention, so we're going to have new planes, new weapons being created, and mixing it in with the energies of religion, we've got religious wars, terrorism, massacres taking place. And where is Pluto? Pluto being what I term the supreme malefic in the sign of Scorpio. Scorpio is a sign to do with death, assassinations, fires and explosions. So it's going to be a very eventful year, 1988, by just looking at the chart. And the Mars retrograde, well, it's in a hard aspect with the planet Neptune. You can see the square aspect, the 90 degree square aspect forming between these 2 planets. And what do we know about Neptune? Well, Neptune is a planet for oil, crude oil. It's a planet that represents the seas, ships, shipping, tankers. So what I've said is we're going to see accidents involving oil ships, tankers, oil out in the sea. Neptune is also a planet for chemicals, so chemical weapons are going to be formed or used. And obviously, we've got Neptune as a benefic planet, representing the ideal form of society, which in that time was communism. So an attack on communism itself in 1988. So essentially the beginning of the downfall of the USSR, the country that was representing communism. So taking those themes into play, what we've got is, I've highlighted crashes because we've got airplanes being involved, and with oils and oil rigs being involved. Fire is definitely highlighted here, and we've got assassinations and massacres. Well, chemical weapons were used during that year, so I've highlighted this as well. So let's look at each one in turn. So starting with crashes. Now there's a long list I'll let you go through it yourself if you want to go into detail, but the main ones I wanted to highlight were the Iran Air Flight 655, which was shot down by USS Vincent over the Persian Gulf. We've got President Mohammed Zia-ul Haq of Pakistan. His plane went down along with a U.S. ambassador to Pakistan during that year. So his ambassador. We also had the Lockerbie disaster happening with the Pan Am Flight 103, which was a terrorist attack that took place. We also had the Ramstein Air Base disaster, the worst air show disaster that has taken place. We've got essentially airplanes that were doing a maneuver, the Italian airplanes that were doing a maneuver, crashed on top of the crowds that were watching the air show, and 75 people were killed. We also had the Gare de Lyon and Clapham Junction rail accidents that took place during that year, again resulting in many deaths. So just wanted to highlight them and say that these are the themes, the general themes, now that we have air travel and train travel taking place. We would expect these to reoccur in future periods when we have Mars retrograde in Aries. And again, with regards to assassinations and massacres, you can see in 1988, the list is pretty long, and just trying to cover some of the highlights of this category during that year. We had the U.S. Lieutenant Colonel William Higgins, who was kidnapped and assassinated during that year. We had the Halabja chemical attack. Now, linking into that Mars with a hard aspect to Neptune, chemical weapons being used in Iraqi Kurdistan by Saddam Hussein. We also had the leader of one of the leaders of the Palestinians who was assassinated by Israeli commandos. We had the Gilgit massacre in Pakistan, where there was a revolt by the Shia people who were ruthlessly suppressed, and the leader of the Shia community in Pakistan, Arif Hosseini, was also assassinated and shot dead. So again, this was linking into the fact that we had the conjunction between Saturn and Uranus in Sagittarius, being the link to religion being involved here. So just giving you a quick highlight of some of the assassinations and massacres that took place. And with regards to the fires that took place that year, we had the Pepcon disaster in Nevada. This was a solid fuel rocket plant which exploded, causing immense damage. I've got some of the pictures here. And equally, we said that with Neptune being involved, we were expecting either oil tankers, oil burning, the sea, and we actually had the Piper Alpha and the Ocean Odyssey rigs in the North Sea, both catching fire and having blowouts during that year. And what about changes in leadership? Well, although no specific leaders were overthrown during that year, we did see the singing revolution start in Estonia, and this was one of the first instances which essentially resulted in the breakup of the USSR. So we had the singing revolution, and we had the uprisings in Burma. So there were a few events that happened, crowds of people coming in and fighting for their independence and freedom during that year. And what about warfare during 1988? Well, actually 1988 saw the end of several wars. Now, we had the Afghan war, where Russia had invaded Afghanistan. That war had been ongoing for 8 years, and that came to an end during 1988. We also had the Iran-Iraq war, which had been raging on for 8 years, with an estimated 1 million lives lost, and that war also came to an end. So what the theme that I started to see was long-lasting wars like the bombing of Cambodia, the Afghanistan war, the Iran-Iraq war. These wars came to an end, and these wars that had been going on for many years came to an end during the retrograde in Aries, the Mars retrograde in Aries. Whereas any new battles or wars that start during this period actually tend to be very much short-lived, and depending on whether they occur whilst Mars goes into retrograde movement or not, it's quite easy then to forecast who's going to win that war. So the outcome of the war can be predicted. Another couple of pictures I included in here, because of that hard aspect between Mars and Neptune, we did say tankers would be involved. So as a result of the USS Samuel Roberts, which hit a naval mine in the Persian Gulf, the US retaliated to that by attacking Iranian oil rigs and tankers during that year. So I thought it was worth just including those in the slides. Another item I wanted to include in the slides was the Nagorno-Karabakh. Essentially, Nagorno-Karabakh, you've got areas of Azerbaijan, which is occupied by Armenian majorities, and they voted to have their own independence, although they're landlocked within Azerbaijan, and obviously the Azerbaijani government isn't going to allow that. And we see this ongoing theme of Armenia and Armenian people being involved in tension every time there is a Mars retrograde in Aries. So what other events happened? It's been an eventful year, 1988. Well, we saw hurricanes and cyclones strike various points of the Earth in the autumn following the heat of the summer and the fires that enraged the Earth during the Mars retrograde. And that would, in effect, be a forecast that we can make for this current autumn that we're entering. We also had the U.S. and the U.S. Air Force acknowledging the existence of the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk plane and the fact that they were developing the B-2 bombers. So the U.S. coming a long way from purchasing the first fighter planes from the Wright brothers in 1909 and now developing some of the most advanced weapons in the world. Armenia, again, coming up once more. There was an earthquake that killed 25,000 people, making 400,000 homeless in Armenia during that year. And on the topic of weapons, now we know Mars is a significator in astrology for weapons. It used to be swords and knives. It went on to become guns, and now we have fighter planes. But again, the U.S. leading the way with regards to weaponry, and we've got the Morris worm, and the first digitalized weapon in the world was developed in 1988, and we've seen a devastating impact that can have. And we also have Al-Qaeda being formed by Osama bin Laden in 1988, and again drawing on that link with the fact that essentially we had the World Trade Centers completing in 1973 and bin Laden forming Al-Qaeda in 1988, both resulting in the devastating effect that happened in 9/11. So we've seen in history over the past 120 years, every time Mars tends to go retrograde in its own house, we seem to have a pretty eventful year, and 2020 was the next time that this occurred. So even before starting the year, we knew it was going to be a big year, and we could take a guess at what sort of events were going to happen, right? So we know there's going to be fires, there's going to be assassinations, there's going to be crashes, airplane crashes, train crashes, likely to be changes in leadership, and wars are likely to occur. And in the other category, we know new weapons are likely to be created. So we know all these points are on the books, and we should be expecting them. But to understand the underlying themes, as always, we go to the chart for that year and have a look at what's happening. And looking at the chart of 2020, well, we've got 3 of the outer planets making a conjunction in the sign of Capricorn. Now, that's a big event. It's a rare event where 3 of the outer planets are coming into conjunction. And what is Capricorn? What does that represent? Capricorn is the leadership structures, our political systems, our economic systems, our leaders. And we've also got Uranus in Taurus, which is the sign for the markets, for currencies, for gold, precious metals. So possessions, all of this is under attack. You got the key 3 planets here: Jupiter, Pluto, and Saturn in Capricorn, referred to as the Capricorn stellium, being under attack by Mars. So key events that should happen where we were expecting assassination of leaders, generals, politicians, attacks on businesses, the economy, the markets. We would expect accidents, airplane accidents or explosions. So this is what we could have forecasted going into the year. And what actually happened? Well, let's have a look. Starting with assassinations and massacres. So we started the year with the assassination of the Quds Force General Qasem Soleimani in Iran. 10 people were actually assassinated during that attack. We've also seen the attempted assassination of the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. He was poisoned, but thankfully he's recovering and was not seriously injured. There's also some talk that Kim Jong-un of North Korea may have been assassinated or has passed away. He hasn't been seen for months. No one's confirmed anything, but that one is a stipulation. We've also had the Croydon police shooting in the UK of Sergeant Matt Ratana. And obviously, I think the whole world saw the images of the unlawful killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which resulted in the riots during the following months in the U.S. Now, the rioting that took place and the energies involved there from an astrological point of view, they haven't gone away, and we're going to see a lot more rioting with regards to the Black Rights Movement and Black Lives Matter in 2021. And what else happened with regards to fires during 2020? It's been a big year. We now know, and I've explained in the previous videos I made, that when Mars is retrograde in Aries, we have an abnormally hot year. Hot and dry weather means, well, it's very easy for things to catch alight. And we know accidents are prone to occur during those periods. So fires was an underlying theme as we entered the year, with the fires that were raging across Australia, and it seemed to work its way from the east all the way to the west. So it's gone from Australia back in January, and it started in November, December time. But from 2020 January, we saw the fires that were raging across Australia. Then we had a string of fires and explosions taking place in Iran. Again, interesting to see that similarly to the explosion of the solid fuel in 1988 in Nevada, a similar explosion took place outside of Tehran. And obviously Lebanon, the Beirut port explosion that took place and rocked that city. So these are familiar images and working its way across to California in the U.S. And generally the fires that have been raging across the rainforests of the world, the Amazon rainforest, and when you look at the African continent, that hasn't really been reported to us. And it's interesting that a lot of articles I'm reading, they're referring to these fires and the cause of these fires as global warming. And it's not global warming, and we've seen this every time Mars goes in retrograde in Aries in previous years, as far back as 1973 and 1988. And I'm not saying global warming is not taking place. It definitely is taking place. But the fact that we have abnormally hot and warm temperature during these years, what I'm saying is that relates to astrological events that are taking place. So we know you're going to have abnormal fires breaking out during these years. And with regards to crashes that have taken place during 2020, started the year with an unfortunate incident involving the private helicopter of Kobe Bryant. His daughter was on board, and there were 8 other passengers on board that helicopter. And only last week we had Zef Eisenberg, who was trying to break the world land speed record. Now, if you remember, I did explain in part 2 of the Mars videos that when Mars goes into retrograde, that's the worst time to be trying to do anything at speed or pushing yourself to the limit. And unfortunately, Zef was trying to break that record and ended up crashing the Porsche 911 that he was driving. Again, at the beginning of the year, we had the Ukrainian flight 752 that was going over, flying from Iran. It happened right after the evening in which Iran was making a counterattack against U.S. bases in Iraq, and everyone was on edge. And it was the Iranian government initially tried to cover it up, and due to pressure, internal pressure and external pressure, they had to admit that it was human error, and they came on. It's very ironic that this event happened. If you look at Iran, during 1988, the Iran airplane was shot down over the Gulf by the U.S., and essentially the same event repeats itself, and this time with the Ukrainian aircraft, but another plane taking off from Tehran's airport and being shot down. And the tables are turned. In the previous instance, the Iranian government was very quick to blame the U.S. and was playing that card for many years, but suddenly they're responsible for shooting down a passenger airplane. And it's interesting how the themes repeat themselves. History repeats itself. And we can definitely see that happening. We had the Pakistan Airlines flight 8303 that crashed, killing 97 people. Another Ukrainian airplane, military airplane, crashed this year. And we also had 2 train crashes. The Llangennych one that happened here in Wales. It was a diesel train, and as a result of the crash, there was a huge explosion, and a lot of diesel leaked into the local area. And this Stonehaven derailment that took place in Scotland. Now I know there were many other train crashes that have taken place. I've only picked up on the ones with regard to the locality where I live, which I've seen in the news. And with regards to changes in leadership, well, in 2020 we saw the Belarus presidential elections, in which Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in power for 26 years, has been accused of violence and election fraud. And with him being re-elected, people became suspicious, and it resulted in widespread violence and protests across Belarus. A similar event has taken place only a couple of days ago in Kyrgyzstan, where they had parliamentary elections, and once again the leader there has been accused of electoral fraud, and this has also resulted in violence and protests across the streets of Kyrgyzstan. And with regards to wars, well, thankfully we haven't had that many wars break out this year, but the Armenian and Azerbaijan conflict did break out, and I was surprised to see Armenia. Well, am I surprised? They seem to get involved every time there is a Mars retrograde in Aries, but I really didn't expect a war to break out with the coronavirus keeping everyone locked up. But it seemed to have broken out between the two countries, and the old conflict which existed seems to have really taken off again during this period. And what were the other events that took place during 2020? Was there any innovation, any new weapons created? Well, the elephant in the room is COVID-19. Now, there are conspiracy theories saying that COVID-19 is a biological weapon that was initially designed to take out people of a specific ethnic background. A lot of information has been leaked to the press. I'm not going to cover that in this video here, but I'm going to put that in as a potential new weapon. We've also had in the past few days news about Russia potentially starting to design weapons in space, and they apparently have a satellite that's been launched that has projectiles that can come out of it. Now, we know countries all across the world are trying to build up their space agencies and get into space, and the US has always been eyeing up the idea that there could be a new generation of space weapons. So again, interesting that we see all of this come to the forefront in 2020, the year of the retrograde of Mars in Aries. So whilst 2020 hasn't ended yet, and we know the energy concerning Mars and Aries is going to go into the January of 2021, so we would expect to see some further events materialize. Let's have a look at the future and see when is the next time that we're going to have a Mars retrograde in Aries. So 2052 is the next time we're going to have it, and even and 2067 is the next time, the time after. And 2067, I'll go on to explain why I believe that's a stronger Martian energy, and that's why I've highlighted it. So what's going to happen during these 2 years? Well, the same themes, and the same themes we're seeing every year is crashes involving airplanes and trains. We will see attempts made to change leadership structure. They tend to happen in ex-Russian states, and we see wars breaking out again. Looking at specifically at the positioning of Uranus and Pluto, we might be able to say where the wars might happen. We will definitely see assassination attempts taking place. Massacres will occur, targeting specific people of specific ethnicity. We will see fires as a result of the warm weather, and we will go on to see new weapons being developed during these 2 years. And let's see if we can shed a little bit more information on each specific year based on the aspects and the positioning of the planets. So starting with 2052. Now, looking at the chart, you can see that the outer planets are quite nicely dispersed. There aren't, you don't see any obvious hard aspects shown by the red lines in the middle. Another interesting thing is you actually see Mars transit all the way through Aries and come into Taurus before it goes stationary at 13 degrees Taurus and works its way backwards, and the retrograde ends at 29 degrees of Aries. So for that reason, because it's coming out of Aries, I don't believe the energies are going to be that strong in 2052. But they will still be there, even if they're not as strong as we've seen in prior periods. So with Uranus in Libra, we've seen that happen before. In 1973, Uranus was in Libra, and we saw attacks and wars breaking out in the Middle East involving Arab nations and the Far East to some extent as well. We've also got Pluto as what I've termed a supreme malefic planet. It's in Pisces. Now, Pisces is a sign for oil, similar to Sagittarius. It does also come into religious aspects of life as well, and endings. So what I've said is we're going to see, given the previous pattern we've seen where Mars formed a bad aspect with Neptune, the owner of Pisces, we should then see oil rigs, oil tankers exploding at sea or being attacked, religious wars of some type, and accidents and explosions involving chemical plants or chemical weapons being used. So these are the forecasts for 2052. And I look at 2067, well, that's going to be a very eventful year. Looking at the chart of the outer planets, we can see that there's a couple of bad aspects forming between the outer planets. We've got Uranus forming a square aspect with Saturn, and then we've also got a T-square, so an opposition between Jupiter and Neptune, and they're both going to be square Pluto. Now, Pluto goes into Aries that year as well. Pluto, Aries, now Mars being, we said, the minor malefic, Pluto on the other side of the spectrum being the supreme malefic. Both planets have an underlying theme of war, action, fire, explosion. The two planets being together and a retrograde taking place in Aries is going to give us a theme of extreme explosions and fires and potential for warfare during that year. So what I've said with regards to the Uranus square Saturn in Sagittarius and Virgo is that we're likely to see attacks and explosions involving airplanes, religious attacks, fire on farms, and destruction to crops and tamed animals. The reason I talked about farms and crops and tamed animals is those are the energies of Virgo. Now, with Mars going into a square aspect with Neptune, well, we've seen that again. In 1988, we saw that, and that resulted in the use of chemical weapons, oil rigs and tankers exploding at sea, and it's supposed to say accidents and attacks on aircraft carriers or battleships. So these are my forecasts for 2052 and 2067. I believe the next time we're going to see a real strong Aries energy and a year to look out for will be 2067. Now, I may not be around, but to validate these, but I hope time and history will tell us what actually takes place and actually materializes.